welcome to the Danube Institute. And I'm going to ask our Director of Research, the great Dr. David Martin Jones, if he will take the podium and introduce our speakers and the program. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Melissa, for that introduction. So the topic tonight is, of course, one very of deep concern to Europeans as well as Americans on the problem of refugees, migrants, and open borders, and we have to discuss that tonight. First, Jeremy Carl, from the Senior Fellow at the Claremont Institute, who's written Mythologies of American Immigration Policy, which will be some of the myths that we need to understand on migration. And Dr. Nayla Rush, Senior Researcher, Center for Immigration Studies in Washington, whose area of research is on which refugees which refugees is the United States welcoming. So we're going to have two learned presentations on the state of refugee migrant policy in the United States. They're going to give us an introduction to this area. They'll talk for about half an hour each, and then we'll have some questions and answers. So I welcome Jeremy first to the podium to give his remarks.
Thanks so much for having me. My name is Jeremy Carl. I'm a senior fellow at the Claremont Institute. Before then, I spent a decade over at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University, for those of you familiar with that. And I was a senior presidential appointee in the Trump administration, although not handling migration stuff. So this is a little bit different. My talk today is called A Nation of Settlers. And I think in Hungary, it's natural to sort of view the US as an immigration nation, almost definitionally, probably, I think, for a lot of Europeans. And indeed, some of my family came to the US from the Kingdom of Hungary in the 1850s. So, there's obviously that story. What I'm going to show in this talk, or at least attempt to show, is that that is at best an incomplete picture, if not a misleading picture, of America's migration history. And in fact, ideology has won over reality, and that matters not just for America, but for countries like Hungary that are also fighting a very aggressive migration lobby. So let's see if this works. Sun Tzu, the Chinese warrior philosopher, talks about every battle being won before it's even fought. And I think that's why I'm sort of doing this. This is going to be a much more conceptual talk. There's not going to be any discussion really about policy. We often lose the battle on the right on immigration because we're not really intellectually informed about the history, so we end up fighting on the enemy's terrain. So I'm not going to talk about current bills. I think Nayla will maybe address some of those somewhat, but I'm going to focus on the historical and ideological terrain that we're fighting on and attempt to equip those in the audience, at least who are sympathetic with my perspective, and maybe challenge those who are not to kind of think about this in a certain, maybe a different way than they thought about it before. So I live in Montana. For those of you who have not been to Montana or been to the US, it's a pretty isolated and unpopulated state. It's also exceptionally non-diverse in general. We're 49th out of 50 in immigrants. Yellowstone, the TV show, for those of you who've seen it, is set about 45 minutes from my house. It's not quite like that, but it's got a flavor of that to it for sure. But one minority group that we do have a lot of in Montana, the only one really, is Native Americans. We have the 5th highest percentage in the United States at about 7%. And if you go to Indian country, as they would call it, in Montana, in little towns like Browning or Crow Agency or things like that, you'd see a t-shirt and sometimes. And you also sometimes see this on college campuses. And it comes in a few different versions. But the one I kind of most like sort of has these, well, I'll just show it because I think it'll be easier. And it says, Original Homeland Security, Defending the Borders Since 1492. There are different sort of versions of this. I've seen the same picture saying, oh, we should have built a wall as the caption. And I let out a chuckle, as a few of you guys did the first time I saw this picture, because it's a clever slogan on its own terms, and it makes the point that's absolutely correct, that when the first European settlers came to the New World, there were already people living there. There were Native Americans. But upon further thought, I sort of realized that this cuts, to me, the opposite way in which I think they're intending, and that to me it shows the dangers of not protecting your borders, language, and culture, which the Native Americans, for understandable reasons, were not able to do in the face of aggressive European kind of settlement. And so they learned that much to their regret. And so I think that failure in my mind, because the fate of Native Americans in the US is certainly mixed, and they gained a lot from being part of this world-spanning American empire, if you will, but they also lost a lot. And we'd like to keep those losses, certainly in America, and I would think also in Hungary, to a minimum. So when I say we're not an immigration society, by that, of course, I don't mean that we haven't had people come to the US. Clearly, that was how the US was populated largely today. But let me just kind of repeat what I think is the key distinction. We are a nation of settlers, in my view. Immigrants come to an established society, and settlers create a new one. Settlement, unlike immigration, is an extraordinarily, in other words, we weren't trying to this is an oversimplification for those of you aware of the details of American migration history, but we weren't looking to largely join Native American communities. We were kind of looking to have our own settlements when we founded it. Settlement, unlike immigration, is an extraordinarily high-risk endeavor almost universally. Just to give you a sense, so here are the three earliest examples of settlement in the United States. The first in my home state of North Carolina, where I grew up, the Lost Colony, 1587. 1590, the supply ships showed up. There were about 130 colonists, I think, give or take. Every single one was gone. Almost certainly massacred by natives, although it's one of the great sort of mysteries of American history because they've never found anything definitive. The next serious colony, 1607, Jamestown in Virginia, 90% mortality. That was even in just 1 year they had almost 90% mortality. It was called the starving time, winter of 1609 to 1610. Mostly malnutrition, also native attacks playing a role. And then the Pilgrims, who are sort of the great success from an American standpoint of settlement, 50% mortality the first winter alone. So these were enormously dangerous ventures when they were taken out. Enormous risk. Settled at enormous risk. And as the colonies got settled, that risk obviously went down, but really for the first couple hundred years at least, it was a very, very high-risk endeavor to settle in the United States. And that doesn't really bear a lot of resemblance. I sort of typed in immigration. This is the graph that came up. The ultimate buying guide for a new home was not awaiting the settlers at Jamestown in 1607. So they're very different phenomena. By the way, I'm not suggesting there are no risks. I mean, obviously there are risks today with migration, particularly irregular or illegal migration. But it's a very different thing. So let's see what the founders had to say in America about immigration. So first we have George Washington. And he said, by an intermixture with our people, they or their descendants get assimilated to our customs, measures, laws, in a word, soon become one people. Alexander Hamilton, of the musical fame these days, for those of you familiar with it, but also a kind of really critical figure in early American nationalism, talks about already having felt the evils of incorporating a large number of foreigners into their national mass. It has served very much to divide the community and to distract our councils. Hamilton himself was an immigrant, for those of you who've seen the musical, and there's actually an interesting story behind all that, but that was his perspective. And then James Madison, the father of the Constitution and later United States president, says, and for those who acquire the right of citizenship without adding to the strength or wealth of community are not people we are in want of. So, sorry, let me go back. They were very aware of this immigration debate and how it affected the future of the nation. And if you read the text of the 1790 debate in Congress on naturalization, which is right after the country's founded, it's really the first major policy debate we have in the United States on immigration, you have Madison understanding very explicitly immigrant is what's about the national interest, not about welfare benefits for immigrants. Hamilton understands that when you have subnational communities that are large and influential, you get dual loyalties. And George Washington kind of understands that only if we kind of have one people can we be fully American. And our current immigration policy, I would argue, works against all of these things. And the notion that America, in this context, if you read these early debates, was intended to be a quote-unquote nation of immigrants is a lie. And I'll go get into the origins of that, the ideological origins, particularly of that phrase, which is used quite frequently in American discourse. But I think it's not enough to simply say, well, it's not true. You have to be a little more sophisticated in your political analysis and say, whose purposes does this lie serve? How is the regime strengthened by this particular not true story that we're telling? And I think its political purpose of this lie is clear, is if we're a nation of immigrants, then it's not just a wrong policy decision to say we shouldn't throw open the door. It's racist, it's un-American, it's sort of against the idea of America itself. And so I think that's why this nation of immigrant ideology is so, because it sort of shuts down debate. That's the sort of value of it. By contrast, my friend David Azerrad at Hillsdale College said in a recent speech, there is simply no precedent in human history for sovereign states voluntarily importing into their homelands untold millions of peoples of different colors, creeds, and cultures for decades on end. This is what tyrants do to conquer a broken people, to pacify them. It is not something that natives willfully do to themselves. And I think that's largely on the money. So interestingly, the question of us being a nation of settlers is not just something that weird people like me who are immigration skeptics think. If you actually go on the left-wing historians, you will find discourse like this. And this is Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz. She's a left-wing historian in the United States. This was actually quite a good-selling book by academic standards. And she wrote a book called Not a Nation of Immigrants, Settler Colonialism, White Supremacy, and a History of Erasure and Exclusion. Now, obviously, she and I have different ideological views on the nature of US immigration, but we agree on some key facts. And she has this thing here where she's saying, during the nearly 2 centuries of British colonization, up to US independence, the great majority of European settlers were Protestant, Anglo-Saxon, and Scots-Irish. It's important to note, I think, in this context, immigrants have never been the dominant force in American society. Even at their highest levels, which is roughly what they are now, but also back in 1910, they were less than 15%. You compare that to something like Dubai, which is 90% immigrant, or Singapore. I mean, those are immigrant societies, but we're a society that's had a lot of immigrants, but I think it's a different thing. If you were to look at the 1970 census that kind of most closely resembles the demographics of the country post-Hart-Celler, which is kind of the major immigration law I'm going to talk about later that really governs modern immigration policy in the US, you'll see that at that census and in the 1960 census, the overwhelming majority of people who were there in America were either white or African American. And we had some Hispanics as well. We had about 3.5% Hispanics, but 80% of them were native born, as opposed to about 55-60% today. And many of them actually had really, really deep roots in the United States or places that became the United States after the Mexican-American War. You go to the Californios or the Tejanos, these groups often went back to the 1500s in living here. So they had kind of a deep identification with America. We were a little bit less than 1% Asian Americans, most of these being recent arrivals. Now, today, on a kind of absolute basis, we have 3 times the number of immigrants that we've ever had. It's a big discontinuity. But it's not just radical historians who are saying this. It's a commentary that goes back to the earliest days of America. And one of the most interesting things is, if you are familiar with the work of Alexis de Tocqueville, Tocqueville wrote Democracy in America in 1830. It's probably the most famous book ever written about the American sort of public life and polity. He does not mention immigrants or immigration even once in Democracy in America. And I'm not the first person who noticed this. There's actually a couple scholars who've sort of observed this. So why is this? Why is de Tocqueville not even mentioning this? Well, again, this comes down to the question of settlement and not immigration, partially. So this is a Tocqueville scholar writing here, kind of trying to explain why Tocqueville is not talking about immigration. He says the initial groups that had come to America 2 centuries before were conceived of as pilgrims, colonists, or settlers, but not as immigrants per se. And again, I want to point out, so America at this time is 2% migrants. It is culturally extremely uniform, with the exception, obviously, of the enslaved, largely enslaved, not exclusively African-American population. And immigration is just not a big thing in this world, and it hasn't been. We are closer in time right now to Tocqueville than Tocqueville was to the original settlement of the colonies. So there's this huge period of time where we weren't sort of ideologizing ourselves as a kind of immigration nation at all. Well, where did we begin to get the first immigration sort of at a mass scale that looked a little bit different? In 1848, and for Hungarians here in particular, that date will have some resonance. We have the failed revolutions in Central Europe largely, and in the wake of that, actually that was when my first relatives showed up in the United States, largely from Central Europe. My wife's family has been here since 1607 or whatever, but largely from the Austro-Hungarian Empire, from Germany, etc. But there was nothing like that in Tocqueville's time. At independence, as best demographers can tell, of our free population, 85% of it was British, and it really was a colonial settler society, I think it's fair to say. But even as late as the 1880s, more than 2/3 of American immigrants coming at that time were from Britain, Ireland, Scandinavia, and Germany, kind of the historical sources of virtually all of our immigration up till the mid-19th century. And before 1881, this is now a period that is encompassing 2/3 of the entire history of colonization. Northwest Europe provided 86% of America's immigrants and settlers. So even if you think that America is a nation of immigrants, it really was just from very few sources up until the last century, century and a half. So let's talk about the patterns of this settlement in a little bit more detail. So this is my own taxonomy, but it just kind of recapitulates a little bit of what I've been talking about. So from 1607 to 1776, you have the British settlement era. We're not an independent nation yet, but you kind of have this time. And for the most part, Philadelphia is the biggest city. I think it's got like 15,000 people. New York, so these are very small things. People are really settling out on frontiers. There's farmers, and there's a whole ideology around that. Then we move into what the American settlement era, I would call it, and it's kind of immigrants and settlers, but again, it's sort of mostly of British origin. Then we have Northwest European and also Central European immigration from 1848 to 1891. 1891, I think, is the first time you could really begin to talk about America, at least for a time. This is just a 33-year period, okay, of being a quote-unquote nation of immigrants. We begin to really take mass immigration from places that we had never had mass immigration from before, largely from Eastern Europe. But not exclusively. We began to have immigration from Asia, some other places. It is not a coincidence that in 1924, after this goes on for a little while, we passed the Johnson-Reed Act in America, which is by far the most restrictive immigration act that has ever been passed in the United States history. It essentially made us, this is an exaggeration, okay, that we didn't have no immigrants, but we had a very, very small immigration policy, immigrant growth between 1924 and 1965, and it was explicitly set to not disrupt the ethnic balance that had existed beforehand, before Johnson-Reed. So in 1965, we get to Hart-Celler and what I would call replacement nation. I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go on because that's the current immigration regime we're living under. So here's just another way of kind of looking at this. US immigration has increased dramatically in volume and radically changed in origins. Again, the left-hand side of this graph only goes down to 1820, but you can see the green is the total number of immigrants. It's very, very small. And then you have this huge wave in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And then this goes up to 2012. You can see it's sort of ever rising. If you had the Biden administration's immigration policy here, it'd be off the scale. That green line would be so big. And you can see, again, he's kind of got the summaries of where these are coming from, and also that's changed in the interim years. So 1890, a couple interesting things happen. 1890, the US Census Bureau declares the frontier closed. And what that meant is there was sort of settlement everywhere in the United States, according to the Census Bureau at this point. And at that time, the great American historian Frederick Jackson Turner of Harvard University was certainly the preeminent American historian of the late 19th century. He goes and he gives a speech at the 400th Columbian Exposition in Chicago in 1892 to kind of talk about the 400th anniversary of Columbus's arrival and celebrate that. And he says, the frontier is gone, and with it going has closed the first period of American history. And again, I'm just beating this drum on thinking about settlement versus immigration, because this is not just me retconning things from back. This is really how people in the society themselves perceived it. So this turns in later to a famous book called The Significance of the Frontier in American History, and Frederick Jackson Turner's Frontiers hypothesis has been influential in terms of, not just in terms of American settlement, but it's been used in all sorts of ways and debated hotly ever since. But it is interesting to note, even at this time, the entire west of the United States and Florida and Texas were so thinly populated, even though they were settled, that they were less densely populated than any state other than Alaska today. So there was still a lot of settlement. Like in Montana, if you showed up in 1890, it was rough settlement. And even native attacks were still like something you were worrying about. But even in more modern, when my mother was born in Phoenix, Arizona in 1941, there were 60,000 people living in Phoenix. It was an isolated small city. Today there's 1.6 million, so it's like Budapest size. So there's been a tremendous change. Meanwhile, in about 1886, right around the time the frontier is closing, something else really interesting happens, which is the Statue of Liberty is rising. And that's obviously a great, at least in the US, a great visual symbol of immigration. But it really didn't have anything to do when it was built with immigration at all. It was a celebration of the end of slavery, of Franco-American friendship, of democracy. The way that it came to symbolize immigration in the public mind was Emma Lazarus's poem, "Give ye, you're tired, you're poor, you're huddled masses, yearning to breathe free." Some of you may be familiar with it. This is inscribed on the statue's base. Now, it's very interesting, the sort of story of this. It was written by Lazarus in 1883, at which point to raise money for the statue's base, along with a bunch of other things, at which point it's long forgotten. But then something interesting happens, when Emma Lazarus dies a few years later in 1887, the statue is dedicated right around then, and her friend Georgina Schuyler, who is a member of the Schuyler sisters, she's actually a direct descendant of Alexander Hamilton. Both these women are very upper class sort of women. She decides she wants to memorialize Lazarus, and she starts this big campaign to get Lazarus's poem put on the Statue of Liberty. And that succeeds in 1903. It's put on the statue's base. At the same time, you have this huge flood that we showed in that graph of immigrants coming into America, and all of a sudden the statue takes on this very new public meaning that was not really the public meaning that it was originally assigned to. So when you have all this and all these different things coming into play, there were obviously people who were not so happy with it. So the Texas Rangers deployed to the border, in the southern border, as early as 1904. The Naturalization Act of 1906 says that you have to be able to speak English fluently or at least proficiently to become a citizen. That's still on the books today. It's widely ignored. Another big factor that at least held down immigration a little bit is that we didn't have a welfare state. And because of that, it was sometimes difficult, much more so than it is today, to get there and make it. And 1 out of every 3 European immigrants from this era actually returned home. Even though returning home is a lot more challenging than it would be today. So the notion that an immigrant could arrive in the US, often not even legally, and receive legal preferences in employment and education and a bunch of other areas would have struck Americans of early generations as insane. And I think it should strike us that as well. But now let me kind of get to the denouement, which is the nation of immigrants. So this is an interesting phrase. It originates with the title of a book by John F. Kennedy. It was actually originally a pamphlet, in 1958. And what I'm going to argue is this is really, it's a sensitive point, but I think it's important to be true to the historical record. This is a product of ethnic activism, okay? That's what's going on. The ADL here, this was the new version of it that was built. This is like the biggest kind of Jewish political activist organization in the US. They were the people who brought this book out originally, when Kennedy's running for president. I'll get into why he wanted to do this. Other kind of ethnic Catholics in big cities were also very involved in this. But we had this book in 1958, Senator Kennedy wants to become president. So he's kicking off his campaign, and he realizes that this kind of urban ethnic vote is something that would be really helpful to him in certain swing states. So he does this, and I think he's also, I want to be fair to Kennedy here. It wasn't that he wasn't serious or that he didn't believe in this. John F. Kennedy's origins, for those of you who know them, he was what's so-called a lace curtain Irish. So he was at the very, very top of Irish American society. His father had actually been ambassador to the UK, is very, very wealthy on both sides, but still, growing up in Boston, he felt like a second-class citizen because he was never going to be a Boston Brahmin from the old Puritan sort of stock. So he felt that, I think, very genuinely. So I'm not sort of saying there's some conspiracy here. I think this was really thought. But we get to the Hart-Celler Immigration Act, and that's the regime we have now. He sort of puts this out. Nothing really happens with it in his campaign. He's assassinated in November of 1963. In 1964, the ADL republishes this in book form with a very explicit kind of charge to push what became the Hart-Celler Immigration Act that was going to change around our immigration policy enormously. Now, given the enormous changes that it was going to engender in American society, it was inevitable that Democrat politicians, let's just say they didn't tell the whole truth about what it was going to be. So here's a couple of quotes. This is a picture of Lyndon Johnson. He's actually at the Statue of Liberty on Ellis Island signing this immigration bill. He says, "The bill that we signed today is not a revolutionary bill. It does not affect the lives of millions. It will not reshape the structure of our daily lives." And then Ted Kennedy, John F. Kennedy's younger brother, a longtime US Senator, says, "This bill will not flood our cities with immigrants. It will not upset the ethnic mix of our society. It will not relax the standards of admission. It will not cause American workers to lose jobs." Well, wrong, 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 and wrong. And I would just observe also, as a veteran of the American political wars, whenever a Democrat goes out of their way to tell you that something is no big deal, you should assume it's going to affect you in a very negative and very major way. And that was just what Hart-Celler did. So it took on a dramatically different character than promised. Again, it's beyond the scope of this talk to get into the intricacies of what Hart-Celler did, but it wasn't what people were told it was going to do. So even by 1968, just a few years after its passage, the New York Times was reporting that the extent of change, in quotes, of immigration because of the new law had surprised nearly everyone. But then they said it was unlikely to be modified because, in quotes, congressmen don't want to look like racists. So I'll point that out because the racial blackmail from the left is not a new phenomenon, okay? So to summarize America's immigration history before turning to its present, for our first 240 or so years, I think we were basically a nation of settlers. Then we had a sort of century where we were a mix of settlement and immigration. And then we didn't really become a nation of immigrants in the public mind until the Democrats needed it for a 1960 campaign strategy. And then in the wake of Kennedy's assassination, they went to get more. So turning from that history to our present age of diversity and inclusion, it's worth exploring how much just quantitatively Hart-Celler changed American immigration policy. So it was really a demographic revolution. So here's a chart I've done of US minorities by race and ethnicity. The lowest bar there is 10 million. I realize that's all of Hungary's population. So these are very large numbers in aggregate, even the ones that don't look so big. But in 1960, before Hart-Celler, Hispanics, a few million, already generally with pretty deep ties to the US. 2020, that's well over 60 million. Asian Americans, again, it hardly even shows up. Now is about 23 million. Black American immigrant population, I have not forgotten to put it there. It's just literally so small you can't even see it. Now it's about 5 million. So I'm not even saying this is good or bad, right? It's a radical, radical change. And we shouldn't pretend that it's business as usual in terms of, oh, this is just how we always did things. It's not. Sometimes people are sending their best, right? But not always. And there are perfectly reasonable arguments to be made that we've benefited from some of this immigration, maybe even from all of this immigration. But you actually have to make them. You can't just pretend that you didn't do something that was super new and contrary to how we did things before. So, lessons for Hungary, just a few thoughts on this. I'm certainly not, I do follow Hungary separately from having gone here, but I'm in no ways claiming that I would be an expert. Just a few thoughts. This is a fairly representative quote from Prime Minister Orbán. I'm sure folks would agree. Hungary is still overwhelmingly Hungarian, but I do not think that it can avoid the broader trends alone while part of the EU's migration scheme, no matter how much the Prime Minister complains about them. Hungary is not an immigration nation, and I don't think it should be, and doesn't need to be. I think pride and emphasis on Hungarian culture is a comparative advantage for Hungary. Again, when Orban dedicated the new music museum a few years back, he really talked about this in a very moving way. I would recommend folks who didn't read his speech there to check that out. Financial pressures from the EU, which you're already seeing, and ratings agencies about, oh, if you don't open everything up, what's going to happen to your economy, are going to be enormous, and they'll need to be resisted. And then ultimately, I think this is the real kind of bombshell, if it were. I think Hungary will have to make some difficult decisions sooner rather than later on the level of integration it wants with the EU. I don't think personally, just my own view, okay, I'm not an expert, that Hungary can stay in the EU at its current level and protect its borders. Within that, if I were Hungarian, I would protect my borders, language, and culture as the first priority, and figure out, and my Hungarianness, and figure out how I'm going to integrate with the Europeans as my second priority. But that'll obviously be up to the Hungarian people to decide how they want to do that. So just a few concluding thoughts to bring it back to a US context. America and Hungary have a legal and moral right, in my view, to their borders and for an immigration policy that serves the interest of their citizens. That may seem like a totally anodyne, meaningless statement almost, but actually I would argue if you look at almost all of the assumptions that undergird our current immigration policy, they don't actually accept this. They do not accept this premise. They think immigration has to be for the benefit of immigrants, or it's a human rights thing, and no. I mean, it's not that those things are not important, but that's the place that we should start in this debate, in the US and in Hungary. In America, how we've been doing it is not how it's always been. This is almost the kind of subject of my talk today, is to really convince you that the nation of immigrants ideology does not really represent the totality of American history, not even close, doesn't represent our immigration patterns. It represents a particular place in time. And then finally, legal good, illegal bad, which is something a lot of our US politicians like to say. This is a losing frame on the immigration issue. Legal or not, America's high immigration levels, in my view, cannot be continued if America wants to be a unified country culturally and otherwise. This is about the legal and illegal replacement of the American people with foreigners. It's been done over the last 60 plus years, often with many with dubious claims to be in America at all, many of whom illegally become wards of the state, and will lead to a fundamental transformation of American culture. And ultimately, in my view, what Americans need to do is, conservatives need to ask the Democrats forthrightly and without apology, is that the best policy for the American people? Not some theoretical future American people that you think you might want to help, but the American people today. And does it serve the just interests of the United States? To quote the Sharon statement, for those of you familiar with it, on foreign policy from the Cold War. And I think that any country that won't ask those questions is not going to survive, and frankly doesn't deserve to survive in anything like its current instantiation. But I think we can survive, and I think the first step of that is to understand the immigration issue. And that's what I've tried to help us do a little bit better today. So thank you very much, and I'll be happy to take questions later.
Well, thank you very much, Jeremy. That was fascinating. So we'll have Nayla talk first, and then we'll open it to question and answers.
Hello. Okay. So hello, I work in the United States. I'm originally from Lebanon, and I became an American citizen a few years ago. I'm very happy to be here in Budapest. And excuse my pronunciation and my throat because I was a little bit sick, but I think it's fine. If you don't understand me, just wave or something. So what I'm going to talk today is the refugee admissions into the United States. And when we speak about refugees, we often think about the border crossers who come to the US and seek asylum to be able to enter the US. What people don't know is that there's an official refugee resettlement program in the United States. that is run by the State Department. And that is a program I'm going to talk to you about today, and talk about the numbers under the Biden administration and how it's run. And I'm going to talk about the Afghan and the Ukrainian crisis and how the Biden administration kind of designed new processes to admit these Afghans and Ukrainians outside the US resettlement program, which is quite interesting because I'm going to show a parallel with Europe. And in the end, just because I wrote about it and just because it's in the news and it kind of touches close to heart, the Israel-Hamas war and how people are asking for Palestinians to be admitted into the US, and I looked at the numbers and at the Muslim population in the US and put this into context. And I'm talking about just refugees inside the refugee resettlement program, not outside. So the program was created in 1980, kind of to give a formal context into refugee admissions and to give refugees federal assistance. How it happens is that every year, every fiscal year in the United States is different from a calendar year here. Fiscal year is from 1st of October to end of September of every year, so we call it fiscal year. Every fiscal year, the President of the United States sets a ceiling for this program's refugee admissions. And of course, it's a ceiling. It doesn't mean it has to be met. It's often not met, but more than that, it can be further than that. It follows the definition of refugee, which we all know here. And another thing that people don't know is the difference between refugees and asylees. See, refugees are admitted from abroad. They are chosen to come into the US by the United States. Asylees come to the US, they have to be in US soil or at least at port of entry, ask for asylum or ask for, if they're going to be deported, not to be deported because they have asylum protection. So how is this program set? It's usually under the United Nations Refugee Agency, UNHCR, who has the international mandate to give refugee status and gives refugee referrals. A number of countries participate in the refugee resettlement program, around 23. The United States is the top resettlement country and the top funder of the UNHCR. UNHCR refers people for resettlement. Refugees cannot refer themselves. It's UNHCR who does. And then inside the United States, there are agencies, we call them resettlement agencies, who are funded by the US to just welcome these refugees and help them through their lives in the US. And obviously, these refugees are accepted on humanitarian grounds and will need to be helped. And so many benefits are given to them. So when we talk about refugees, there are like 23 million refugees by UNHCR determination in the world today. So are every refugee in need of resettlement? That's not the case. The resettlement program is supposed to be just for refugees who have left their country of war, have sought asylum in another country, but even in this country of asylum, hosting country, they are not safe for whatever reason, either because they are not safe for sexual preference or medical needs, etc., etc. And that is when UNHCR says these people need to move to the West and cannot stay there. They're not fleeing war, they are fleeing the country of asylum they went to. Again, out of the millions of refugees in the world, UNHCR says around 2 million are in need of resettlement, and obviously it cannot refer 2 million. The average of referrals every year by UNHCR is 100,000, so sometimes more, but that's it, throughout the world. So resettlement is a durable solution. What does it mean? It means that these refugees will go to the country of resettlement to stay and become citizens. It's not temporary. And it is one of the three durable solutions, which is obviously return to the home country if it's safe, or local integration, stay where they are and become integrated. The third option is to be resettled. Resettled refugees are future American citizens by law, by US law. A refugee is obligated to apply for a green card 1 year after arrival. There is no choice. And after that, he or she can apply for American citizenship. So I call these refugees the lucky few, because obviously you have millions sitting around in hosting countries. People say in camps, most are not in camps, they are in cities and struggling. So why and how are these picked? A few of them are just picked to be resettled and get a life abroad, whether in America or elsewhere, and get a chance to the American dream. Some people even say that it is unfair because what it costs to resettle one refugee to the US, for instance, you can help 12 more refugees in their own region. So it's more costly to bring a refugee here, and it's unfair for the others. I think that this does not stand, because I'll tell you why. Resettlement is because it is to help people who cannot stay where they are in a country of asylum. It is not to help everybody in a country of asylum. So my boss, Mark Krikorian, gave the imagery of a boat where you have 12 refugees stranded in a boat. And he said, instead of sending a nice boat to rescue one, how about we send life jackets to the 12? I say, resettlement, if it's applied as it should be, it is about sending the life jacket to the person who cannot swim. And if the others can swim, they will manage. So resettlement is about saving lives, and that is how it should be applied. Now, is it applied like that? I have my doubts, and I talk about this. But what happened under the Biden administration is that this selection process, the selection of refugees who get to have a chance at a nice life, is becoming more arbitrary. And I'm going to talk about it later. So a few numbers about refugee admissions under the Biden administration. The ceiling, as I said, the president set the ceiling. A ceiling is a target, doesn't need to be met. It sometimes is not met. So President Biden always spoke as soon as he got into power that he's going to welcome refugees. So he set the ceiling as 125,000, and we see the numbers here. Last year's admissions were half of the ceiling, so it was 125,000, we got some 60,000. The Biden administration blamed the Trump administration for not being able to meet the target because Trump kind of disintegrated the refugee system, which is partly true, but it's not the whole thing. The other reasons is that you had the border crisis, which kind of meant that you needed to send resources to get these people help. You had the Ukrainian and the Afghan crisis, which I will talk about it later, which were admitted as parolees, as temporary admissions, but then they were given benefits as a refugee. So these also needed resources to help these people. So resources are not indefinite, and the Biden administration found itself not being able to bring as many refugees as it wanted. However, next year, this fiscal year 2024, with the ceiling of 125,000 will be met because the Biden administration modernized the refugee resettlement program with the digital program, with more refugee officers, with online interviews, etc., etc. So the numbers will be met next year. Just for comparison, I give you the numbers under Trump, and you see the ceiling is lower, and the admissions were even lower. So what the Biden administration is doing now is expanding on the refugee resettlement program. When you had UNHCR select refugees and resettlement agencies in the US welcome them and help them. It's kind of following a program, a private sponsorship program in Canada, where it's an American, a US sponsor they call them, can just decide to sponsor a refugee. Right? The American has to be an American citizen, a green card holder, and even a conditional green card holder. This is a conditional green card holder, someone who was given a green card for 2 years, and after 2 years, he has to follow the process again to be asked. It's conditional. So even the conditional can do that. So they create this program where 5 sponsors, US-based sponsors, can come together and say, hey, I want to bring this or that person to the United States under the refugee resettlement program. They say it's private sponsorship. It is not, because the State Department is funding this, what they call the consortium of organization, which will in turn help and fund organization, which will in turn fund the sponsors. It's complicated, but it's kind of simple. Anyway, so it's not really private, it's taxpayers' money. The first part of this program was set to just bring refugees who were already been accepted to come to the US, who were referred by UNHCR. The second phase, which is started in November now, they call it the naming, meaning somebody in the US will name and pinpoint and select their own refugees. It's important because, as I just said, newly arrived refugees have green cards already. So a newly arrived refugee who has a green card can now select somebody to come and follow and become an American citizen. So it's not about saving somebody anymore. It's about just you being here and selecting somebody that the others will follow. It's a different denomination totally. Under the Welcome Code, they also designed something called the Welcome Code on campus. You had refugees coming to American university communities. Now you have refugees coming to American campuses, meaning the same system is you have people coming together with the organization, the institutions, etc., to decide who is going to come to an American university with a tuition, paid for, housing, etc., etc. So you bring somebody, they call it an education pathway to citizenship, because remember, a refugee has a green card, so you bring a refugee to study, and then they will become an American citizen. And again, it's the private, because behind the private sponsor, you have a lot of organizations who, if you don't know who to pick, they will come and tell you who to pick. And just a detail here, it's 145 institutions in the US have already signed up for this Welcome Code on campus. And I show here that it's not private, it uses federal funds. So let's go to 2 crises that we all witnessed, the Afghan crisis and the Ukrainian crisis. The Afghan crisis happened, and we all saw these planes where everybody was rushing into the planes, and they were taken outside of Afghanistan, some straight to the US, to some military camps to be processed, and some outside. These Afghan evacuees were not, as we were told, Afghan allies for the most part. An Afghan ally is somebody who worked with the US government, and because of this, he's under threat for his life and his family lives from the Taliban, so he needs saving. It is not the case. So what happened is that most of these people who were brought on the plane just because of the chaos needed to be then accepted in the US, and they were under humanitarian parole, which is supposedly a case-by-case acceptance and of entry into the US and temporary, but that the Biden administration is kind of using to just bring people inside and stay. Now, the parolees have limited access to benefits. However, Congress passed a law that gives Afghan parolees the same benefits as refugees. They can have green cards, but they have all the other benefits, employment authorizations, etc. And then they designed another private sponsorship program where they allowed Afghan parolees to then sponsor other Afghans to be brought to the US. So it's kind of a circle that's happening. And another program that's recent, it's what they call the Afghan Family Reunification Program, which allowed Afghan parolees who are supposed to be temporary, right, in the US, to bring their family members as refugees. These refugees will become green card holders, and that is how they could sponsor other families. Now, United for Ukraine, we saw the crisis. United for Ukraine, what people need to, I think, really keep in mind is that whether in Europe or in the US, they were not accepted as refugees. They were not given refugee status. They did not apply for asylum because of the urgency of matters and to speed processes. The EU decided to give them temporary protection, which is kind of all the benefits an EU resident has. So every Ukrainian refugee in Europe has these benefits. The US opened up this, what we call the United for Ukraine, which allowed private sponsor in the US to also sponsor Ukrainians to come to the US. And again, they gave these Ukrainian parolees refugee benefits and not status. So every crisis that we saw for now, apart from the regular refugee resettlement program, you see when a crisis arises, it's like the EU or the US comes up with a different program and a speedy program to give protection, because asylum takes years. And then you might wonder why then we are stuck with the same regular refugee system, which many scholars are saying is becoming obsolete and needs to be changing. So that's when I talk about the selection of refugees here, when we see that Ukrainians are coming here out of, not because they are in danger in a country of war, because they don't want to stay in Europe. When we see Afghans coming here for no reason, not because they are SIV, or probably not because even they fear the Taliban. You have millions of people who are in Afghanistan. Everybody's going to fear the Taliban and say, I want to come, and then you open up for millions. It's impossible. So at one point, who is coming here? When we have people here selecting in the States, selecting the next refugee, in fact, who is coming? Who are we saving? Who exactly is being saved? And who is being left behind, who really needs to be saved? Remember, resettlement is only the tip of the iceberg. We see millions of refugees and then a few thousand are selected to be resettled in Western countries. And we only talk about these, right, because they are coming to Western countries. The millions who are left behind and the money who's spent on them, I don't see much talk about that. And perhaps we should think about who's being left behind. So to bring matters into more current affairs, I heard about the Israeli-Hamas war. I heard one Hamas leader say that in fact, somebody asked him, well, you are protecting yourself under tunnels, right? You have built those tunnels to protect yourself, and why not build bomb shelters for Gaza civilians, right? And he replied, this, it's the responsibility to protect civilians in Gaza lies in the hand of the United Nations. So that was his reply. And I thought, okay, let's see. And I looked at the US contribution to the two UN refugee agencies, UNHCR and UNRWA, who is specifically, UNRWA is only for Palestinian refugees, and I came up with the numbers. Trump decided to stop funding UNRWA, and so for the 3 years, first he cut it in half and then cut it to zero, but the Biden administration. But other than that, the funding for UNHCR and funding for UN was the same under Trump. So the international organization was funded billions of dollars by the US, no matter who the president is. The only president who stopped something was Trump to the Palestinian refugee agencies. So another thing that I was wanted to see is when I lived in a country of war and the Palestinians came to us as refugees, etc. So, and then when I saw all these riots in the world, in Europe, in the United States for Palestine, I was wondering what was happening pro-Palestine and not necessarily anti-Hamas, not to say anti-Israel. And some Congress lawmakers suggested that we needed to open the door of the United States to Palestinian refugees. So I wanted to look at how many Palestinian refugees we admitted under the refugee resettlement program, the official one, in the past. These are the numbers that far I couldn't go beyond because the Biden administration actually limited the amount of information we could get before we could get everything. You can go to whatever you wanted. Now it's more difficult. And so only 2,000-something Palestinians. But then President Biden talked about the Muslim world, and in his speech he addressed the Palestinian American community, the Muslim American community. So I wanted to see, well, what about the Muslim community in the US? And you have some 250,000. Now, I'm not saying that every one of those is a pro-Palestinian. Perhaps people left because they were anti-Palestinian, they were anti-whatever regime was there. But it's fair to say that people who leave a lot of times take with them their belief and biases. One lawmaker said we should welcome Palestinian civilians because these are not terrorists, which is fine if you can determine that these are not terrorists, okay. But civilians also bring with them beliefs and biases, and these civilian refugees will become American citizens and can become lawmakers and can influence the public opinion, as we saw in the US. And so that is something to keep in mind, that it's not just being a terrorist, so fine, I left the terrorists out. It's about bringing people who will bring their own beliefs with them and values, and not necessarily leave them behind, and then they will, when a crisis will show and come, they will want to influence American policies. For the good or the worse, it's up to you to decide. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Nayla, and thank you, Jeremy, for those two extremely interesting presentations. So, Jeremy, you were talking mainly about the issue of migration and immigration, and the extent to which immigration is now changing dramatically the demographic makeup of what was seen as the American nation prior to 1965, and the dramatic shift that's occurred since, and that any administration should be asking the question, do we want migration, really, if it's going to culturally change the character of America in a really dramatic way? And Nayla, you were addressing something slightly different, really, which is the status of the refugee and how a refugee has been defined historically, and how that change in the refugee status has affected our understanding of what a refugee is. And I suppose the question that occurs to me is, I mean, is it still possible to, I mean, there is an official distinction between a refugee and a migrant, but the problem, the mass nature of migration now means that all these sort of definitions are becoming either redundant or changed in ways that we fail to have a coherent grip on. So I wonder if I could throw that to both of you. And
one thing that I forgot to mention, I don't know if I did, is the new program inside the refugee resettlement program, the private sponsorship. Refugees can be selected who don't even have refugee status by the UNHCR refugee determination. So anybody can then be welcomed as a refugee. Of course, USCIS at one point, which is the US government bureau, will in the end have to say yes, they're refugees. But we are slipping away from somebody who really needs saving, who's really in need, in danger, to somebody who is, okay, let's come to the US, and, you know, the selection process is what I'm having problem of. And what you talk about is kind of the same when all these migrants, many, if not most, are coming and asking and claiming asylum protection, meaning we need protection, and then it's not a refugee status by definition, but it's the same protection, except you don't have green cards. And that is an entry ticket now. It's like a claim that migrants have learned that they can come and ask for. My problem is, and that is why I say, who are we leaving behind, is that I feel that the people who really need saving, nobody's really looking into them and asking how we're spending money on them. The US is spending billions every year. But how is UNHCR really helping? And accountability is here, I think, important. Who are we leaving behind, and how is this refugee asylum claim is becoming so trendy that it means nothing anymore?
Yeah, Mark Krikorian, who's the director of Nayla's Institute, a good friend of mine, you know, he has it very memorably talks about remain in Rwanda as the kind of thing. He correctly says that we just need to junk the entire current asylum. Now, you know, you probably have to be more responsible. I'm with Claremont. Nobody expects me to be responsible, at least in the U.S. press. So I'm not going to try. I mean, let me just be very plain. Most of the refugee and asylum stuff right now is an utter scam. We're being taken advantage of as a country. This is not to say, I mean, obviously, clearly there are refugees in the world. Clearly there are people with legitimate asylum claims. The number of them showing up properly in the US as the first country to do that, it's asymptotic to like 0% in my view. Maybe it's like 1%. If you kind of understand the underlying law. And we're simply being taken advantage of. I do think, here's the kind of the bone I'll throw rhetorically, but I mean it genuinely. We do have an obligation, as much as we could have any international obligation to people who are not American citizens as Americans. I think that the international community, quote unquote, should try to protect people who really are at danger, you know, imminent danger because of where they live or for whatever reason. But that doesn't necessarily mean they get a visa to the United States, right? Like those two things should be very separate phenomena. You can either establish protection or you can move them to another country that might not be as attractive as the United States, and that's also a good way of weeding out the legitimate claims from the non-legitimate claims. So I think there's lots of ways that we could go about doing that, but the bottom line is that a lot of people internationally, and unfortunately the Democrats, just have no interest in doing that. They just want to bring in everybody they can bring in, and you know, the consequences be damned, in my view.
So what kind of policies should be implemented If, you know, I mean, we know there's, you know, the numbers of people moving either for economic migrant reasons or because they're in conflict zones, etc., are in the 20 plus millions probably, and they all seem to want to come to the West. They don't go, you know, Palestinian refugees don't seem to want to go to Egypt, and they certainly aren't invited to Saudi Arabia or Qatar. They're not invited to Egypt either. So, I mean, what should be, or what can be, a coherent and, you know, kind of legal response?
Well, I mean, I think at some level, this is where I'd love to see us spread our political influence and really knuckle down on people rather than seeing which new foreign war we can get involved in. But, you know, I'd love to go to some of these countries and say, hey, look, you know, these are people who are a lot more culturally similar to you than they are to us. I understand there's some issues. We're happy to pony up some money to make this a viable prospect for you. We're happy to consider other things with regards to our bilateral relations. I mean, you've actually seen this with Egypt gets several $billions a year essentially to keep peace with Israel. I mean, functionally, that's what they receive foreign aid for. So it's not unprecedented that we would use our foreign aid in that type of respect. I don't think this is unilaterally an American problem either, although obviously we need to take a role. But as far as us, again, this is now just a personal view separate from the historical thing, but I think we've been so flooded with immigration. We are in that period right now, just like we were before we passed Johnson-Reed in 1924. We need to have a net zero immigration policy. Doesn't mean zero, by the way, because you could eliminate about 15 million illegal immigrants from the United States, and then you could selectively choose people who would be in the United States' interest to bring in. But I think we just need an immigration pause completely in the United States on a net basis so that we can recohere some sort of unified national identity. And in fact, that's what happened in the 1950s and up to Art Celler. It was kind of almost, in some ways, the mythologized heyday. And that's because we had time to unify as a country after a huge period of immigration. If we don't do that, you know, I hope we're not going to have a Lebanon-style situation. That's a particularly, but I just don't think the history of these sorts of stories ends very well, typically. So I hope we revisit it in that context.
Okay.
What I like to remind people, and I'm sure all of you know, is most refugees go to neighboring countries. And the millions we don't talk about are the millions we don't see. So you have 2 million Syrians in Lebanon, a country of 4 million, 500,000 Palestinians, Jordan, Egypt, everywhere. What people focus on is these few thousand that come, and I'm talking about the refugee resettlement program, which is an official program set by the UN, are the people we bring here, we decide to bring here. I think it's also the selection of these people is quite problematic. I think it's like we're playing God, like you come, you don't come, you come, you don't come. People of the same condition. The UN randomly decides who should come, and now the Biden administration has made it even more random and arbitrary. Somebody who's in the US just because can now decide and pick their own refugees. It is, to me, mind-blowing. Accountability with the money we spend, we give to the UN refugee agencies. Where is it going? What's happening? Is it really helping refugees? And remember that Trump, whoever, Trump, Biden, Obama, everybody, gives the same amount of money to UNHCR. And still, UNHCR, I think we need to have more results. So the tip of the iceberg of these refugees who come here is only the tip of the iceberg, and it's made worse by the selection program that it has become totally arbitrary. So I would say, fix the resettlement program, go back to the roots, go back to what it was meant to be. It was meant to save lives and then help refugees better what they are, help them help themselves better.
Okay. Thank you. Well, I'm sure this discussion should be opened up to the floor now, because I'm sure you've all got some questions about the status of immigration and immigration policies. So have we anybody who wants to ask? We got one, somebody here. There's someone. This is right there to the right. Yeah.
Thank you so very much for coming. I enjoyed both of your talks this evening. My question is to either speaker, and really whoever feels more competent to answer the question, and that's sort of targeted seeding immigration. I'm thinking of communities such as Minneapolis in Minnesota that's had a very large influx of Somalis in the last 10 or 15 years, or the Kurdish population in your neighboring state of Idaho. How did that come about, and when did that start? How did that happen?
Well, I think we probably both take this. I think some of it is just the natural dynamics of immigration. And again, there's no conspiracy, and as much as I'm a huge critic of American immigration policy, I don't want to bash immigrants, right? Like, most of them, the vast majority of them want to come here for good reasons. Like, they want to improve their lives, they may totally believe in the American dream. The question is just whether that's in our interests, right? Like, that's where I come down on it. So I think the general pattern of, you go where your neighbor or your cousin went. I mean, I'm sure there was some things with like Catholic Relief Services, particularly settling Somalis in Minneapolis. So there's a little bit more to it than that, but I think this is also just some long-time natural dynamics. But this is a classic example to me of how negative the consequences of so much of our immigration policy are. You took this totally peaceful, non-contentious, like hyper-Scandinavian society, and now downtown Minneapolis is like a crime scene. And that's even before we got into the George Floyd riots. So how did that help the United States? I mean, I appreciate that, I'm sure, look, Somalia under Siad Barre, I'm sure was like a really bad place. People wanted to get out. But that doesn't mean that it was in our interests to let them in. So that's kind of my bottom line.
So refugees are resettled. I talked about the resettlement agencies in the US. The UNHCR decides who's selected. Resettlement agencies decide which state they go to. It depends on the local affiliates they have. Once you have a Somali translator or somebody who can help Somalis, and then it's easier to bring in the same place. And then, migration networks is very important, but it's the resettlement agencies who decide. The refugee does not decide where they go. They have no clue where they are going. After they settle, they can leave and go wherever they want, right? So we have these resettlement agencies who decide where refugees should go. Trump tried to stop that and give state and local some voice and say, no, we don't want refugees resettled here. He was stopped by a judge. So it is these organizations. Now, it's going to be even wider because of the private sponsorship that the Biden administration is setting up, and they said explicitly it will eliminate the geographic resettlement of refugees because it's private sponsor everywhere in the US. You don't need a local agent or a resettlement agency. So they want them everywhere.
And not just with respect to the refugee issue, because this is a very important subset, but there's a much broader immigration issue. I think I saw just in the last year, the Biden administration voluntarily flew 220,000 plus people into the American interior. Now, virtually all of those people are illegal, and again, I refuse to kind of engage in the sort of, they're migrant. No, I mean, they're here illegally. And we simply, to say that we don't have, I mean, I have the willpower to get rid of them, and a lot of Americans have the willpower to say no, but our government simply chooses not to enforce the laws, and the media has decided that's fine. So, I don't know what we can do beyond that besides me speaking at some of these things and maybe convincing people.
And if you notice now, the busing of what they call to New York of migrants, and New Yorkers are not happy. And it's like, okay, so Texas is saying, okay, well, that's what we got. How about you try and see if you can help them, because we can help them. So you see, this diverting is causing problem. But Somalis are mainly in the US as refugees, and they don't decide. Resettlement agencies decide.
Thank you. There's a question here.
Okay, thank you. I'm a PhD student from LT University. This issue about refugee is very interesting for me. So my topic research is about refugee. I have a question for Dr. Nayla Rush. Your material is very interesting for me. I have a question. How can countries that transit refugees improve their chain of resettlement, especially when those chains seem to be very limited for resettlement? And then the number of refugees is increasing, and this will also be a problem for the countries where they are transit. Because of the long wait for get resettlement, is there a recommendation for an advocacy model to minimize so that refugee and local community remain safe? Thank you.
Sure. Well, as I said, refugees go to neighboring countries, and you can expect the millions of refugees to travel wherever, to the US, to Canada, wherever. So this is why you have two scholars from Oxford, Betts and Collier, who wrote a book about the refugee system that is failing refugees and only talking about these refugees who go to rich countries and not talking about refugees who stay in Jordan, in Lebanon, whatever, and are handed humanitarian aid while they don't want to be handed humanitarian aid, and they cannot be integrated in the economy, in the local system. This is where I think the real, we need to address these issues more than just, let's pick the lucky few and play God, and oh my God. And then it's for a few also, let's remember it's a poison gift. Some come here, Ukrainians have come here, left the protection in Europe and ended up homeless in New York, because the sponsor didn't want to, after one day or two, just, okay, I'm not doing that. So point is, we need to help refugees better. The old system always through UNHCR is not working. I don't know how to make it work, but it's not working. We need to redefine the whole thing. It's writing a blank check, I always say. It's like patting yourself in the back and, I'm great conscious, I'm a great person. Whether it's Trump, Biden, everybody, billions of dollars to the UN, and that's it. Second thing is diplomacy, and the only thing is stopping the wars and having people go back to where they, because most refugees want to go back home.
Yeah. Okay. Another question?
Everybody's hungry.
Yes, Simon, let's go.
So thanks for your talks. So my country, Australia, as Jeremy and I were talking about this, has a famously based policy in relation to illegal immigration, but it has very high legal migration policy. So we have a lot of, so a country of 25 million, the last 2 years, or I think it's this year and next year, we plan to bring in over 1 million migrants. Planned flow, and that's par for the course to a large extent for Australia. We generally experience we've had this policy for many decades where we have quite a high number of migrants. The question I have for both of you, I guess, is the ramifications of bringing people from parts of the world who choose not to assimilate so much as I guess live in cultural ghettos. And I think we're seeing, this is the question that everyone's asking in Europe right now. So we see some Muslim populations, definitely not all, but some sectors of the Muslim population starting to behave in ways which are causing great civil unrest. And this is a migration policy issue. How can this be addressed? I'll open that question up for you to discuss.
Well, interesting question.
Well, I'd say at a baseline, and again, I'm not trying to gild the lily here at all. Diversity is not, ceteris paribus in my view, a good thing. in running a country. Uniformity to a greater degree. Again, I'm oversimplifying. Obviously, I'm not saying you shouldn't have any diversity or you shouldn't have any immigration, but these become problems. I mean, ethnic conflict is as old as the Hittites and whatever group you want to come to. This is just a natural part of the human condition. I'd say beyond that, just let me address the kind of legal numbers and why I don't like the legal good, illegal bad frame that a lot of people use on this. So before I lived in Montana, I lived in Silicon Valley. I was surrounded by some of the nicest, most pro-social immigrants that you could possibly imagine. They were highly skilled. They had really good jobs. They were not crime-prone in any way. They were, if you were just to kind of do a baseline survey, if you want to do things in this way, they would be way better than the average American whose family had been there for hundreds of years. But they came in such numbers that white Americans eventually have fled Silicon Valley. This is not a rhetorical device. You can actually look at the census, because it became a culturally alien place. If you're like me and you're sort of from middle America, you're sort of turning around and like, well, this is not like, it's like a really nice country. I mean, I've lived in India. It's like a fun place to live, really interesting, but it's like, this is not a place that I recognize. And so even with these immigrants at this scale, who were super pro-social, who were great, nice people, good neighbors, past a certain point, it just becomes, it's not even the culture that you're going to recognize. And so that's why I think there is an immigration advocacy group called Numbers USA, and that's where I think that numbers becomes really important in and of themselves, and not just, do they have this cultural thing or that? Because a lot of these people are lovely people, but past a certain point, the country becomes a very different country. And I didn't sign up for that personally, so.
What Australia did was saying all asylum seekers, you don't have the right to even seek asylum in Australia. Right. So if you want, you can go to these islands, Nauru, and stay there forever, or go to another country, be a citizen, but it's not happening here. And they stood strong, and it worked. So nobody's trying. I think it also shows that policy from that side works. On the cultural level, as I said, people, migrants are people. They bring with them. I bring my accent. I bring my hummus, or whatever you want to call it. So we bring we bring our beliefs and biases. Not everybody's going to leave those behind, especially in the modern world where you have connectivity, where you have TikTok, where you can call your family every second and speak Arabic or speak Hindu or speak whatever. Everything is there. I wrote a piece on talking about the Afghan evacuees. They evacuated Afghans to military camps. One of them is Quantico, the Marine Corps base in Virginia. And I came across this case of a young man who was evacuated 2 months into his stay, before he was released as he was processed, supposedly evacuated because he was fleeing the Taliban. And he was charged with inappropriate, I don't know what you call it, sexual behavior with a minor and having porn thing on his phone. So he said, I was reading his lawyers plead to the court, US court, for a lesser sentence, saying that his culture, it's okay. He does that. His father married young, and he's married, the person accused is also married to, 13, 14, I don't know. So that is okay. And even the father of the victim, the girl who said, well, it's okay, let him marry her. So not to judge, but there are systems that are there. There are systems that exist. And for us to say, oh my God, we're just going to accept everybody and everybody's going to become American, it's arrogant and it's unrealistic.
Yeah, and just to add to that, because this is a really important point, and it is arrogant. I mean, it really is. It's arrogant to think that everybody is going to want, your culture. I've traveled for years in the developing world and lived in a developing country, and I have a real appreciation for the difference throughout many, many different countries for cultures, as I think anybody who does that. And George Borjas, the immigration scholar at Harvard, along those lines, wrote a book called We Wanted Workers. And it's from this phrase because from some foreman they introduced, or maybe it was a politician saying, trying to explain their immigration policy, saying, we wanted workers, but we got people, right? And that's the issue, right? People are not just, much as the libertarians hate it, they are not just interchangeable units of labor. They are people with values, cultures, which should be respected in my view, and beliefs, and those may or may not be compatible with the beliefs that we have in the United States, okay? And so, like, that's gonna be a legitimate factor in my view for who we should let in and how many people we should let in.
And times change, like in France, sorry, last word, like in France, the previous generation of people from the Maghreb, Muslims, they would let their kids have a Christmas gift and Christmas tea because we don't want to, look different. Now it's opposite. Immigration, the country of immigration, immigration is not the same. History is not the same. Context changes. People are different now. We have to address things today.
Okay. Melissa, you got the last question. Oh, no, we got maybe two questions. Melissa?
One comment first, and that is female genital mutilation is not part of the American culture, but it is taking place within the Somali community in Minneapolis, and it's a shame. Now, my question, mostly to you, Jeremy. Since there's an agreement that the current refugee program is broken, I'm playing, a what-if game. Could you see a situation where the U.S. government decided, okay, we're going to repatriate that program. We are going to manage that program. That's my question.
Yeah, well, Aya Hirsi is at least a friendly acquaintance of mine. Her husband's kind of a friend of mine. I actually just was emailing with him yesterday. So she's been a Somali woman who was a victim of female genital mutilation, has obviously spoken out about that issue and many others as well. So certainly agree with you there. As far as what we could do, and I would say this is true with immigration policy broadly, we just have to be much more aggressive. Trump allowed himself, Stephen Miller and other people there, they really did know what needed to be done. They allowed themselves to be stymied way too much by judges. They simply need, it's all going to come down to, for people like me who are thinking about 2025, not just on immigration, but particularly on immigration, I guess, from the context of your question, we need a much more aggressive Office of Legal Counsel in the White House, who is going to come up with the reasons why we can legally do the things that we want to do. And we're not going to let the kind of BS deep state games that the federal judges love to play against us with their nationwide injunction from some random district judge in Hawaii. We're simply not going to let it go. Right? And this is actually, if this seems extreme to some of you, if those of you are familiar with Abraham Lincoln, what he did in the Civil War, he simply, in a clever, strategic, and constitutional way, he didn't ignore certain judges, but he basically narrowly interpreted their rules. There's all sorts of things you could do with simultaneous constitutional interpretation. If you want to do it, if you have the will to do it, I think we can make real progress absolutely within the rule of law, but it's going to require an aggressive legal counsel in the White House who's willing to not just kind of be worrying about what law firm partnership they're going back to, but who cares enough about the country, they're willing to take the risks to write legal opinions and then stand behind them. So I think that is going to be the entire game for whether this stuff really happens.
Yeah, do you want to add anything?
I think you're right, but as long as you have the convention, UN convention in Mark, my boss says we need to leave that refugee convention. I don't see it happening, but I think more realistically, I agree with you, but Trump has this, like the Muslim ban, and he banned refugees from Iran. Well, most refugees from Iran were Christians, so it wasn't a Muslim ban and stuff like that. So perhaps doing stuff more, not diplomatically, but that will go somewhere. It's not just, I'm going to build the wall, not build the wall, do this and don't do this.
Well, but not
divisive.
You mentioned the quote-unquote Muslim ban. This is sort of the level of media disinformation that we're operating in. Because it wasn't a Muslim ban. It was the same 7 countries that Obama had identified previously as having risks. So it wasn't even something that Trump came up with. And there was an entire organized opposition ready to go in airports at year one, probably paid for indirectly once you traced it by the US taxpayers, or dare I say it, George Soros in this audience. But that's sort of where we are, right? Like we're in this world where I have to pretend that the Muslim ban was like something that was real, rather than simply something invented out of whole cloth that was an extension of a category that Barack Obama had himself put into place. So I think that's kind of what we're dealing with. And again, it's just a question of like, are you going to have the guts to take the hits? I mean, I do, obviously, as maybe some of you can tell. I don't mind taking those hits, but a lot of people in Washington don't sort of operate that way.
Thank you, Joe. Catherine.
Thank you. So my question is a little bit twofold. So one, what do you think of the green card lottery? And two, I can kind of guess, but I'll ask that anyways. And two, you mentioned that, you know, the kind of immigration, though you want it significantly decreased, the kind of immigration that you want in the U.S. is the kind that benefits the U.S. So my question is, what are the aspects that you think would, and I guess for both of you, what are the aspects that would benefit the U.S. in your view?
Well, to address, and maybe I'll let you take the green card lottery specifically, but the diversity visa, which kind of operates under these same things, because I think it's sort of, again, the most extreme example of just how much our immigration policy doesn't even have the pretense of working in America's interest. So we have about 55,000 so-called diversity visas allotted each year, I think maybe 60,000 now, that essentially are specifically for countries that don't have historic strong ties to U.S. immigration. Now, why you'd ever want even one of those, I think, is from a U.S. interest standpoint, is debatable, but let's just stipulate it. There were various immigration deals proposed a few years back that would have eliminated those and replaced it with an equal number of visas. So there's no net reduction in visas, but they would be focused on high-skilled immigrants, you know, people getting PhDs in computer science or something like that. The Democrats would not do that deal. Okay, so yeah, it's hard to kind of work with folks who are going to take that attitude. But obviously, I think there's always should be room in the U.S. for truly best and brightest type people. And this is another thing where it kind of maybe folds into my original talk about U.S. immigrants and immigrant needs changing. We took a ton of low and zero skilled immigrants 100, 150 years ago. We were a rapidly industrializing and agricultural power with tons of arable land that was vacant. That made sense in the context of our particularly societal and labor and industrial needs at that time. We live in a very different country right now in terms of our needs. And so the kind of need for low-skilled labor is just much less in my view. And the only people who offer that it's more are people who don't really want to pay their dishwashers very much money, and that's not personally a view that I have a lot of sympathy with. So.
Numbers, you spoke of numbers, USA, they make the point that actually more immigrants helps the most vulnerable American workers, because you bring mostly low-skilled workers, they come, and then whoever is struggling or new immigrants are going to struggle even more. So you're not benefiting anybody with American. And you don't have a right to become American, I think. I mean, I'm sorry, I say it because I have earned my right, and I am, I think, very blessed to be American. And if one day they say, no, go back, well, I'm sorry, but I will. I abide by the law of the United States. I don't come and change it. I admire the country, and I defend the values. I don't go and bash stuff. Anyway, the other thing is, the lottery is like this selection. This one and not this one. So you become American, what does that mean? You just come and then become American and live the happy life? Well, probably you won't. It's tough. It was tough for me, and I have a PhD and I have a job. So imagine somebody who's struggling, and I speak English. But anyway, point is, migration is tough. You leave the familiar, you leave the roots, and you come here. But if you want to, you are grateful they gave you the opportunity, but not everybody will have this outlook. same thing as birthright citizenship. You just go to the U.S., have a baby. The baby's American. I mean, I've seen, and I'm not going to say, but some Lebanese will travel to the U.S. They're 7 months pregnant. My baby's American. The baby's back in Lebanon. He's never been to the United States. He's never spoken English, and he has an American passport. I think that too, the lottery and this, is just need to go.
Okay, well, on that note, I think we've, we haven't exhausted the topic by any means, but we've exhausted ourselves. So, and I think if you've got other questions, you can approach the speakers and I'm sure they'll answer them. So can we thank Jeremy and Nayla for their very entertaining presentation. Thank you.